Welcome to the Accrivia Training video, which focuses on the Creditor PDF Invoice Load. This form actually loads file formats of other type as well, like Excel, but it's predominantly geared around the PDF file format and is the screen of choice to electronically load any invoices supplied from your creditors and suppliers. The first part of this video will cover the usage of this screen and the column headings and what the data means and how to use the screen. The second part of this video will focus on overcoming the errors that might be found when the data is loaded, and each of the possible reasons for being unable to post the transactions are covered in detail. By placing your mouse over the horizontal progress bar, you will find the YouTube segments are offered, and you can then jump to the relative section. The first part of the process is to import the PDF files that have been stored on the computer or the network to be loaded. The location of these files can be seen by pressing the Open Folder button. This folder location is part of the associated files filing system within Accrivia, which is defined in the system settings, and all files to be loaded need to be placed in this folder. We do have the ability to scrape emails and auto-save these PDFs, so contact the Accrivia support desk if you would like to have an email scraper set up as part of this system, in which case we will download the PDFs from your suppliers and your creditors and auto-store it in this location, ready to be imported. The Import PDF Files button then sweeps that folder and brings all of the available files into the screen, ready to be processed. As I mentioned, the first part of this video is now going to focus on the data we're seeing, what these columns mean, what the buttons do, and how to navigate and drive the form. You can see we have orange, red, and green colouring status under the checked column. You cannot load something that is being flagged in red. There will be an error and there will be a reason that one cannot proceed, and we are going to cover each of those reasons in detail in this video. An orange status means we can proceed, but we're wanting to highlight something that isn't entirely in order, and as such you need to be aware of that and potentially take action around that. This example is showing a red status in the pricing column here, and if I double click on that, what I can see is that the agreed rate that goes with that item for that supplier is $51.90, but the invoice rate has come in at $52.53, which is clearly above the agreed trading rate, and as such Accrivia is not happy to proceed without your confirmation, which will also flow on and have an impact on how we are going to treat that pricing difference. Again, I'm going to come to that in full detail very shortly. A green status, especially where it's entirely green across all the cells of the line, means everything is in order. We have no concerns with the data we've loaded. We've matched the quantities to the purchase order. We've matched the pricing to any agreed pricing schedules. And as far as the Accrivia system is concerned, you are absolutely fine to proceed with that one without any checking whatsoever. The Select Valid Lines for Post button here will tick all of the items on the screen that we're able to post, including those lines that have been coloured in a warning status colour. So do be aware of that. It's not just the green ones that will proceed when using that button. Obviously, the intention behind this screen, once all the data is set up and correctly mapped, is to see as many greens as possible and to have as little work to do manually as can be to achieve posting all of your supplier invoices. That would normally be the case. I have quite deliberately created all sorts of complications with this data for today's video because I wanted to then draw out the reasons the system cannot proceed and to cover that in the training video. But what you would expect to see when you're using this screen is the vast majority of loaded data immediately coming in as green, with the ability to proceed very quickly and to post all of those invoices through, leaving a very small quantity to be further investigated. When we are happy with the data that we are going to post, we do then press the Post Selected button in the bottom right corner. That will then post the invoice onto the creditor's account. It will attach the PDF document that was supplied to the invoice transaction that's posted in the system, giving you the ability to not have to store or manage the PDF or the physical hard copy if you've got one. Everything in then is electronically available in the system going forwards. I'll now run through all of the column data on the header record, as well as the expense allocation grid, as well as the stock details. If the invoice being loaded does not have stock associated, so it might be a service provided by a supplier, for example, a Telstra bill, you won't find any stock in the lower half of the screen. It will only be the expense allocation as per the normal posting of an invoice in the creditor invoicing screen. For those suppliers where stock is associated, of course, we will see the stock on the invoice against the stock on the purchase order. So starting with the top form, checked, as I said earlier, allows us to put a tick in place to say I'd like to post that invoice when I press the post button. You will not be able to select a transaction for posting where there is a red block in the checked column. And the reason for that will be shown in the top right corner where our status is. It might be, in some cases, that there's other additional reasons beyond the status that's listed here. And this is an example of that, this Fletcher line, the second line, where the purchase order status is awaiting receival. We will not allow you to post an invoice for a purchase order where it hasn't been received into the warehouse. It's beyond the scope of this version of this screen to do that. You must have received the stock into the warehouse through the inventory stock order receive menu. And as we'll cover soon, the quantities must align. So if we have a different quantity of item or a different item, though substitution is supported in terms of the purchase order data versus the invoice data, then we will not allow you to proceed in that case. The creditor code is as per your creditor code. When you first bring data in, if you do find a question mark in this column, that will be because of a lack of template that's supported for that supplier. Should that occur, you need to email that PDF document to the Accrivia support desk. We will set the template up for you, and then your local machine will communicate with our cloud server that holds all the templates and download that template automatically, allowing you to then both recognize who the supplier is and all the data that's on that PDF document, and then to do a double click action and map it to the creditor in your system. The invoice reference, the date, the amount inclusive of GST, the GST amount, are all data that's been read directly from the PDF document. You can zoom in on the actual transaction in the preview pane here, or you can press the button up the top here, which pops the PDF document out into its own viewer, allowing you to examine that data, resize, zooming, etc., supported in here as well. What you will find is if you're doing some comparison analysis between the PDF document and the data on the screen, then sliding this onto the second screen, if you have your computer set up with two screens, makes for a very efficient and effective way of comparing the data on the document back to the data on the screen in terms of the stock down the bottom there. Closing that window simply puts the focus back and puts the document, if you will, back in the actual viewing pane on the right there. I will cover these menu options in full detail as we work through the video today, but it is worth noting that if you need to send us a PDF document that isn't currently supported, then you're best to right click on the transaction, click on the menu item that says Show File in Explorer. We will then open up that window on your machine and highlight the transaction that you're on. Now, you will notice that there is a whole lot of letters and numbers after the filing name that is tacked on and appended to the original file name. That is to ensure uniqueness. Some of the suppliers we have found give their invoice file names the exact same name for every single invoice, which is somewhat problematic for us. We need it uniquely identified, of course. So we decided to append information to make it unique when it's moved through to the loaded file. And that way we don't overwrite any previous loaded transactions that were given the same name by that supplier. The purchase order reference has been picked up from the actual document. So there is key information on the document that we need to read and we need to use. Things like the stock code, the quantities of what was supplied, the pricing information, the Inc and X values. We can have freight involved, for example. But one of the key pieces of information is your purchase order reference in the Accrivia system that goes with the invoice we're loading. And we must be able to pick that information up if we are to properly align all of the stock and the data that we're seeing. Of course, different suppliers have different formats and that information might be sitting in a different spot. That's not a problem. There's the example in this case of where that's found. The important part is that the template that we've set up to go with that supplier's PDF documents knows where to find the key information. Another thing worth noting at this point in time is Accrivia will do its very best to identify the right purchase order reference where there are multiple choices due to back ordering. It is possible if we have had an original purchase order with multiple back orders that have been received into the warehouse and the invoice processing is delayed and we haven't yet processed those received orders through as an invoice, it is possible we will pick up the wrong reference. So you might have a -1, -2, -3 representing each of the back orders. If that occurs, what you will find is that nothing is lining up. Now, we've got some deliberate data here today where things aren't lining up, but I've caused that deliberately for training purposes. In the real world, you would expect to see things lining up quite neatly. And if it doesn't, it is possible you'll need to double click on a given purchase order reference and choose the alternate information that goes with the selection list, noting that we now show the amount, Inc and X on the load screen. So if you are looking to align a purchase order in terms of the value of the purchase order back to the value of the invoice, this process now is easier to do because assuming some difference in terms of the stock and the value of the purchase order, you can actually see which one's going to come in closest to the invoice value. The purchase order amount in GST is just read straight through. A red font here is indicating that the value of the purchase order doesn't match exactly to the value of the invoice. There may be very legitimate reasons for that, and that may not be a concern. The most legitimate reason probably is a freight charge that's been put on the invoice that wasn't on the original purchase order. And quite often in those cases, you'll find the difference between these two is roughly around that, give or take a little bit of rounding around stock pricing, depending on your setup and having all of your agreed rates to 2 decimal places or 4 decimal places, etc. The purchase order status is very important if we are dealing with stock invoices, and we must, as I said earlier, have the received status against that purchase order to be able to proceed. There may well be nothing wrong in terms of our data with this second line on the screen. However, given the purchase order status is awaiting receival into the warehouse, we cannot proceed. That's not a problem in the sense that the invoice has been loaded in prior to the warehouse guys doing the receive action. And when you finish the action of posting what you can today, in theory, the only ones left will be those that are still awaiting receive. And when you then next open the screen, we will refresh the data. that will pick up that this purchase order has now been received into the warehouse, allowing us to proceed forwards. So putting that another way, there's no problem having the invoice loaded into this screen prior to the warehouse doing a receive action. In theory, that's going to be a very close period of time, within a day, we would expect. But there's no problem. The data will sit on this screen and just wait for the warehouse guys to catch up with where we're up to here. Standard cost update is the equivalent mapping to the pop-up screen at the end of the creditor invoicing process and allows us to update our standard pricing on our inventory file for that item or to not do so. So what we can see here is the invoice rate on this particular item from this particular supplier is $163.63. My standard cost rate in this Accrivia system is $158.05. Clearly, they are not aligned, and clearly, I have got my standard cost stated lower than the invoice rate, which is a concern because the margins that I think I'm achieving by selling that item to my customers will not be achieved. In actual fact, the cost will be higher, the average cost will reflect that, and the true margins I'm making will be less. So we've highlighted that in an orange colour, which, as per the legend here above, is that the pricing is somewhere between 2 and 10%. If it's out by 2% or less, it will go bold, but it'll still be green. And you can see again, my current standard cost there is under. So again, my margins are going to be less than I'm projecting in terms of my inventory setup. This is more of concern, clearly, because the percentage difference there is between 2 and 10%. And if it goes above that again, above the 10%, it will go red. This information is reflected up the top of the screen by double-clicking on this field here. And what we can see is that we've got agreed pricing information, and we've got I'll use this line here because we've actually received it in and it's more complete in terms of the data I'm working with. So you can see double clicking on that is showing me my invoice rate. It's showing me my agreed price, which is actually under. So that's a concern. We're actually going to talk about that. It's in red and we're not going to be able to proceed without some override type information going on. And our standard cost is set 1.2% in that case and 3.4% in this case below the invoice rates. So that's where my margins would be less than I think I'm achieving in terms of my buy price being higher than the inventory file suggests. The comment field, as per the normal creditor invoicing screen, allows me to double click and enter a comment that I might want to put against this invoice, and that will then go through and post. Agreed pricing override is a rather important aspect because if this is not set correctly in terms of the way we're operating, the system will actually deny me the right to post that invoice. So using this one here as an example, my agreed pricing differs to my invoice rates, and I have the option of updating my agreed price to match the invoice rate or not updating. And if I choose to not update, i.e. the agreed rate that I intend to purchase of in future is still $158.05. On this occasion, I've paid more, but going forwards, I'm still wanting to maintain this rate. Accrivia will not let me post that invoice anymore because I've got a red status up here that the pricing does not match, unless I explicitly tell it that I wish to override agreed pricing. By putting that tick in, I will now turn this back to an orange status, meaning I can in fact proceed and I can post, and I won't be updating my agreed price on the inventory item. I'll be proceeding forwards and accepting this invoice rate, but it's taken a tick up here in this top grid to achieve that override to be able to proceed. So putting that another way, Accrivia is trying to protect your agreed trading rates with your suppliers. If we were to bring this item up in our stock maintenance screen and have a look, I've got my standard pricing, I've got my supplier agreed pricing defined, and I am therefore saying every time I purchase from this supplier this item, this is the rates I'm expecting to pay. So if the invoicing process does not align to that, our position is you need to actually override that difference to accept and proceed forwards. You'll notice a few fields now that are in grey. That represents data that's been loaded and set as part of the import of data, and you can't change that necessarily. You can at the first instance when you set things up, but once we've got that information locked in against the account, we are going to use that to draw the data on this screen together in a holistic sense. So those are on the screen for revealing to you what's going on, but they're greyed out. You can't do much about that. If the transaction we're dealing with is a credit note, not an invoice, this tick box will be in place. That is part of the template configuration. So we will either determine that through the reference on the top of the paperwork, saying credit, not invoice, or negative values or some other distinguishing factor, and you will see that in place, ticked from the load. For clients running authorization as part of the invoicing process, this tick will be in place by default as per the normal creditor invoicing process where you can post the invoices manually, and all the same business rules that apply in that screen with regards to authorization for invoices, certain levels, different divisions or companies, all that applies here. The approver and the second approver are applicable in the same way. Beyond the scope of this video to cover that in full detail, because that can be seen and drilled down in other places throughout the system. Where the purchase order relates to a debtor's order, we will show you the debtor's order and their reference in here. You can double click in here and you can actually choose to realign that to another order's reference if needed. The reason we allow you to double click and override is on occasion, the loaded data, which has come from the purchase order, which draws back to the original debtor's order reference, may need you to tune that up. Again, we might have had a back order situation occur with the debtor's order, other sort of fringe edged scenarios. So we do allow a double click action to reselect that. But as a rule, if that's applicable, you'll find it's in there. No stock details is the difference between a supplier invoice with stock or a service type invoice where it doesn't relate to the actual stock in your warehouse. It might be office furniture, it could be a service bill like Telstra, and you'll have the tick there. That tells Accrivia when we process that, which we'll cover shortly, not to bother with any of the details down here. It also turns off the validation for much of the things we've just talked about in terms of stock, purchase orders, validation, and that sort of thing. The warehouse obviously is the warehouse the stock is destined for those with a single warehouse in their system. That'll be filled in, but it'll be the same thing all the way through, obviously. Just referencing back to the debtor order, we will tell you the status of the debtor's order in here if we have got one that's loaded through. A few more things to mention. The audit log information here is maintained by the system, and we're basically picking up actions that you do where you might reset to a different purchase order or make some other changes. We're just going to log those to the audit log and post that as part of the transaction. So if there's a question down the track as to how something came about to be a certain way, we should be able to give you that answer from our audit transaction information. The pay by date column represents us determining from the invoice when the transaction is to be paid, and you can manually set that if it's blank and you wanted to do so. But as per the normal creditor invoicing screen, the manual process, you do not have to do that if the payment date of the transaction falls into the normal terms of the creditor's account. So when we set an account up, we define in here whether it's paid on 30 days on statement or 7 or 14 days from invoice date, etc. as a default. So that is the account settings, and that's what will happen for every transaction unless there's an override. So you can set that manually. If we do find that on the PDF document, we will bring that in and fill it in. And again, that is a supported field in the mapping template. The payment date and default payment type are more recent additions to the Accrivia creditor system and allow us to define against any given creditor's account how by default we would pay, so whether that be EFT, most of the time these days it is, and if it's automatically debited from our bank account or taken from a credit card, then how many days after the date of the invoice does that occur? And then the tick here, Invoices Auto Paid, locks that in, meaning if you post the invoice through the manual invoice posting screen or through this PDF load process, we will be looking to achieve the payment going through, and you won't then need to do the payment yourself. So that's actually an important distinction, that if you have got a payment arrangement set up with some of your suppliers or creditors, set it up on the creditor, and this invoice processing will not only take care of the invoice being put in the system, it will also put the payment in, reconcile it, and everything's done. You don't have to revisit it any further. A couple of other fields that relate to internal data handling on our part that you can pretty much ignore, but if it has come from an Excel file, you'll see that noted there, the source of that file, in much the same way that we reveal the PDF document name, and its location is stored internally behind the scenes, as I said earlier, as part of the actual setup of the associated files system in Accrivia. Moving on to the middle grid, the invoice details, the expense allocation, a very similar layout and feel as per the creditor invoicing screen. We do have the ability to split costs across branches, so you might have a charge from an external provider like your accountant or something, legal costs that wanted to be spread across multiple branches or divisions. So there's no trouble adding in additional lines here. The one thing that the system's going to demand, if we do take that approach, is that ultimately things balance up. If they don't balance up, we can't post it. And you can see here, we know the value of that invoice that we've loaded. We got that information from the PDF document. So if you've altered the expense allocation in such a way that we don't balance, we're going to tell you that, and we're going to force you to address that before we allow you to proceed and post. The comment can be entered at an expense level as per the creditor invoicing screen. Our BAS type is coming from the creditor setup and the nature of the invoice transaction we're taking. If that was GST not applicable, for example, then our GST would have to be 0. So there's going to be some checks and balances because, again, we've loaded data, so we know behind the scenes what we're dealing with in terms of amounts. Contractor costs, job labour, job number and section number. For those clients running the Accrivia job costing system, this is all very applicable. And again, we'll draw the default information from the creditor that you're dealing with. I've deliberately not gone down the track of bringing jobs into this training video, though if you are using our job system, it's fully supportive of identifying the purchase order information, the job it related to, filling all this information in. It will just go through with business as usual. So these ticks will be behaving as per the creditor invoicing screen based on the nature of the subcontractor we're using, whether it's labour codes, etc. Discount days and discount dollars, again, if the supplier is set up to have settlement discount terms, these will fill in automatically as per the creditor invoicing screen. Moving now onto the last grid on this screen, and I'm going to reset myself back to a transaction up the top here that has stock. You can see the word invoice here, and that runs, the data there runs from the quantity, includes the description, the rate, the GST, the line amount, X, and Inc, right up to the stock code field. That all relates to the invoice information we've loaded. The purchase order data is the stock code, the quantity, and the description, and the rate X GST. The standard cost data here relates to our inventory system, and whether we're going to update our inventory system with the information from this invoice. By default, these values in terms of that drop box will be determined by your system settings and your default configuration in place. So whether there's no update applied or whether there's an update of the standard cost or an update of cost and sell is as per the system settings that go with that data. Of course, not applicable will apply anytime the rates are exactly the same in terms of what's in the Accrivia data versus the invoice that you've just received. There's no need to flag as an update or no update because they are already the same. The agreed cost information is coming from the Supplier tab of this item and this supplier. Obviously, you can have multiple suppliers for any given item. And again, we are going to flag any pricing differences in a font, bold, orange color if it's between the 2 and 10% as discussed earlier. And then the update of this will default to whether we're going to update the agreed pricing based on this invoice rate or not going to update. As discussed earlier, not updating where there's a difference does require us to have an agreed pricing override to proceed because we are deliberately choosing to step outside the normal boundaries of what we would expect is standard operations. If we've said we'll pay this price, we're expecting to pay that price on the invoice. Before we go into the specifics of looking at all the reasons we may not be able to post a creditor invoice and to cover each of those in detail, let me just quickly talk about the right-click action and all of the sub-menus that are offered on the upper grid here. Reset to default approver relates to the process of having invoice approval for clients running that option. You'll be familiar with the process from the normal creditor invoicing screen. And all that's going to happen here by running that is it will reset the data in those far columns here that related to the approval process back to what it would have been. Manually edit a line, I'm not going to cover that in this video. It's probably beyond the scope and you'll seldom, if ever, need to use it. It was put in back earlier when this PDF processing screen was going through its infancy build. And we needed the ability on the operator's part to sometimes edit the data to achieve an outcome. What we've done over time is to tighten things up to the level where you should never need to manually edit anything. The template configuration should be correct and your data will then drive everything else forwards. Recalculating the values for this line allows us to look up the stock item, the agreed pricing, the purchase order data, and rescan the PDF and reset all the information on that line in both the upper, middle, and lower grids. And it may be quite applicable to run this when you've made changes to the underlying data in Accrivia. So for example, I've gone and reset some agreed pricing or I've reset the standard costs and I then want to do a refresh. That would be the action to take and that will give us the latest information on that invoice on the screen. We can manually process any invoice at any time from this form, thus making this screen something of a dashboard. So even if we've loaded an invoice that doesn't have a template defined, and we're not going to go to the trouble of having a template defined, that might be something we choose to not bother to do for a supplier, for example, that we only engage with once a year, still load the PDF in, right click on it, manually post the invoice. We'll carry as much information across into the process as we can, so you'll have to key less or you'll have to select something if we don't know, but it's still at the least as efficient as manually processing that invoice yourself and then choosing all of the various steps to actually get to the right outcome. Purchase order view and purchase order receive, run these two menus from the dashboard here. The difference being that we know the purchase order information so we can jump there directly. So if I go purchase order view, it'll take me straight to that purchase order in the current inventory system as per opening it up under normal circumstances. And if I was on a transaction where I'm still waiting the receive action to occur in the warehouse, then this would allow me to go through the receive process here. It should be noted we're expecting that process to be done at a warehouse operations level, but it's possible that they've confirmed the quantities of what was received, and that's very important that that's been done accurately, of course, and we're going to now process the paperwork to go with that. So the arrival date will be defaulted to the invoice date. If there's a day or two of delays around freight and transport, that may not be accurate. You may need to change that. And then whatever is your normal process for receiving stock in, whether you're defaulting the received information or you're keying it yourself, depending on your system setting, go through that process as you normally would. And post that, I'm not going to do that right now, I want to leave the data available for further discussion. And then we've got the ability to proceed forwards. Worth noting that when we process this screen, if we have not yet done the receival, it'll stay on this screen, it'll be there next time we open it. So there's no problem having the data just sitting and waiting for us to have the warehouse receive actions catch up to where we're at with our invoices. Creating a back order is a menu that won't be used by most clients. Some clients have a situation where they issue a purchase order to a supplier and they simply supply the purchase order reference. This is usually done through our mobile device, our app, Accrivia app, and often relates to our job costing clients. In that situation, the general standard is one purchase order ties to one invoice, and it's a very clean one-to-one linear approach. On occasion, there's need to split that purchase order into a back order manually to then achieve the alignment with the invoicing process. For clients who need to do that, you'll be familiar with that process or discuss that with the Accrivia support desk. But for most other clients, especially where you've got warehousing considerations as your primary stock handling, this is a menu you won't use. And you can see it's been grayed out. It will have context around the data that's available for each of these menus, and we'll grey the menu out if it's not applicable. The view debtor order and edit debtor order, again, they are greyed out because I haven't got information showing up in here. If that was locked in and picked up from the actual load, I would have the ability to view that debtor's order. It'll open up the debtor maintenance screen, go straight to that order. Or edit it, will open up the debtor order screen and select that order on the right debtor's account and throw me in to do some editing. That may be necessary if the supplier's invoice has come up short compared to what we were originally expecting, and we were trying to make sure our charge to the client stays in line with the supplier invoice. That's essentially why this menu is here. But as I said earlier, these are all ways of achieving the same thing. It's just that we've got a little bit more information available to us in this screen so we can actually get there more efficiently and auto-select certain data for you. Lastly, view invoice lines, show file in Explorer, and view import logs. The show file in Explorer is the one you would use if you need to send us a PDF document where the template hasn't identified who that's from, and just email that through to the support desk. View invoice lines and view import logs, more technical type information of what's going on behind the scenes in terms of how the system's running. You will seldom need to use that, potentially if the support desk is doing some drill down on something that hasn't gone as we would expect it to. You might find these guys are running those menus, but as a rule, you won't need to worry about those. They are more of a technical nature. So that concludes section 1 of this training video, where I've covered the basic screen layout, what you're seeing, the buttons, how they get used, as well as each of the column headers and the data that you're seeing in the 3 grids, the invoice header, the expense allocation, and then also the stock that's applicable. The second part of this video will now look at each of the reasons that an invoice may be blocked from being posted in Accrivia. As I said earlier, we've deliberately set the data for covering each scenario, and what you would be looking to see once things have been set up correctly and you are running well is vast majority of lines just being green here, ready to proceed forwards immediately without any drilling down or any concerns and considerations. The first scenario we're going to consider is an orange status. So we are able to post this invoice, but we are drawing your attention to something being not quite as we would expect. So as we look at the data in the lower part of the screen, we can see that the rate X on the invoice is not matching to the standard cost nor to the agreed rates. So the red bold font is indicating things are not aligned. If we went to another transaction where everything was in order, we have no red, we have no bold. The colouring sequence in this case is that it's within 2 to 10%, so it's not even close in one sense. This one is also out in terms of the direct comparison, but it's within 2%, so it's a lesser margin. And this will result in us achieving a lower margin at the time of selling these items than what is set up on the stock maintenance screen. Clearly, if we have said that we are purchasing at $25.04 and we're actually purchasing at $26, then we're above in terms of our invoice rates and therefore our margins are less. This one here is actually the other way around. We've set our standard cost at $48.33. We've got our purchasing rates at $46.02. We're going to make more margin. We're going to be in front on that one. It's still within the 2%. And it's also bolded because it's not exactly the same, but that would represent a scenario where if you were setting your standard costs with a slight amount of margin protection, if you will, where your standard cost is deliberately set above your purchase rates to give you something of a buffer, a safety buffer, a margin, then that's essentially what we're flagging for you there. There's no error, there's no blocking, that will allow it to be proceeding forwards. This one is of a much greater concern because the cost that we are taking up, $26.43 on the invoice, is more than our standard cost by 5.3%. So whatever margins we are set up to achieve with that item in our stock maintenance screen, $25, 49%, 100% markup, so basically double the price. That's not the case. We've got at least 5% of our margin there being overstated by what we're truly purchasing at. And that would reflect in the average cost across time. This might be a one-off scenario with our purchasing, but if that's an ongoing trend, that's what we're paying in the future, we're drawing your attention to the fact that that probably needs to be addressed. The other data here is in order, so there's no other colouring going on. And as I said earlier, we've got an orange status here indicating there's no errors as such, we're just drawing your attention to a concern. So you could very much proceed forwards and tick that one for posting and everything will go through as expected, but being aware of that difference. The second scenario I want to discuss is where the warehouse has not yet received the order in. You cannot proceed in that scenario. You will need to have that purchase order received in, and then we'll be able to then determine whether our pricing is in order and other things that may then need to be considered. As things stand at the moment, we do have some variations between the pricing that can be seen if I double click up the top there in the status. It can also be seen down here. This third transaction is received in, so that is fine. But we have a pricing variation between the price on the invoice, the agreed price that we have intended to purchase with the supplier, and I've said not to update the information there, which has required I tick the agreed pricing override. If that was not ticked, this will go back to being red. You cannot proceed forwards without agreeing to override the standard agreed pricing that I've got in place with that supplier. So that is very much a legitimate scenario again that I can proceed forwards. It will be orange, so definitely no hard block, it's not red, but you will not proceed forwards without being alerted to the fact that things are not exactly as we intended. The cost update status is a summary reflection of the information in the lower grid as well. Whereas the pricing status data is telling me everything that's going on, the cost update is a reflection essentially of the sum of the information down here. The reason we've done that is to give you an instantaneous view in the upper grid, a summary position, if you will, of what's going on in the bottom half of the screen. A lot of the data here we're using in this training video, we've got a few lines on it. You might have 35 lines on an invoice. And in those scenarios, it might be a case that you wanting to monitor the sum of all the information just by looking at the upper grid and then looking and delving down into the details depending on what the upper grid is telling you. That's essentially the design intention around that. So this third transaction that we're using in our training video today is okay to proceed, but with a fair warning because our pricing is not in order. This fourth transaction is deliberately created to really draw out a scenario where the warehouse has not received the quantities in that matches to our invoice, as well as a second scenario that the system has not managed to match up the quantities of something that is correct but is not defined correctly in Accrivia in terms of us knowing that to be the case. If we go and have a look at this product code, what we'll find is the supplier code is 400368X. Now I've quite clearly put an X on the end of that to create an imbalance that will then allow me to demonstrate how this works. But the bottom line is, because that has not matched up perfectly to the invoice information that's come through, there's no X here, Accrivia is unable to proceed with matching up the line on the invoice to the line in Accrivia. Two options are open to us. One is to fix the underlying data, and that will not only allow us to correct this one transaction, it'll also mean that in future, everything's going to be in order, and we are going to do that. But before I do that, I want to show you what you can achieve through manually aligning the data. I could open up that line on the screen here that represents the received purchase order data with the plus at the left end, and I can press the match line button. And now I get the choice of which stock line on the screen would I like to manually assign that to. For the sake of demonstrating how the software works, I'm going to deliberately choose the wrong thing. Quite clearly, through the description and the quantities, that top line on the invoice there is not the right one. The 180 quantity here actually goes with the second line. And something I'm about to cover in a second is that the 120 here does in fact match this bottom line. However, the warehouse guys got it wrong and they've received in the wrong quantity. So we're going to come back to that in a second. Let's show you what happens if we choose the top line. The system's now saying, all right, this is a product substitution. I'm essentially going to misalign a scenario to get an outcome. Where might this be applicable? I think where a supplier has supplied an equivalent product, but it's larger in size. So you've ordered a 4.2 metre sheet, plasterboard, they've supplied a 4.8 or a 6.0 because they didn't have stock of what you asked for. And they've said not only is that the equivalent scenario in terms of practical usage, we will charge you at the product you asked for. We will not charge you for the higher value product because it was our fault we couldn't supply what you actually asked for. So that might be a very legitimate scenario, product substitution. You will have to determine some of that just through the natural knowledge of what you're doing. I'm going to go yes. What I want to draw out here is substitutions occur. We can see the colouring going on, but look at the quantities. The quantities are not matching up. We've already said we received 180 into the warehouse. That's not going to change. However, the pricing we're being charged for it is going to now create an outcome where things are not neatly lining up and our average cost would be impacted because of that fact, but it's still quite valid to do. This one's not very valid, clearly, but if it was a plasterboard substitution, it might be quite valid to do that. You just need to be aware that ultimately what we end up with is the hybrid outcome of this item, these quantities essentially hit our warehouse, but this is the pricing information and the alignment we're making in terms of the invoice itself. I'm going to undo that because I want to rerun it this screen a couple more times and show a couple more features of the system. So by choosing recalculate values for this line, the system will draw in all the information from the PDF again. It'll draw the information in from my stock system again and bring me back to where I started a second ago. What I will now do though is to repeat that process and choose the correct alignment. So I'm going to choose the 180 for the 6mm, 3.6 by 1350 as the matching outcome. It's identifying still the product by the supplier code in Accrivia. As you can see, they are close, but they're not exactly the same. And now what's happened is that the system is still technically seeing that as a substitution. In a more technical sense, it's not. It is actually the right product. It's just that my data has thrown the system out in terms of that alignment. But now I've got one of the lines here lined up properly, and the invoice amount on the screen has started to reflect the truth of what's going on. The amount here is the matched up total. So the invoice total is known, but this middle grid is representing the stock side of things. And what we've got to get back to is no imbalance before we can proceed forwards. So taking on the second part of this, 240, 120, yeah, that's the right product. But clearly in this case, I'd have to communicate with my warehouse guys and say, hey, did we get 240 or did we get 120? We've been charged 120. You guys have received in 240. The purpose of this training video was to demonstrate the process here. And the truth was, no, we didn't get 240. Sorry, we messed that up at the receive time. There was a back order part of that was involved. We should have back ordered the 120. We only got the 120 at this point in time. So the process in Accrivia to achieve that outcome would be to undo the receive of that purchase order, redo the receive with the correct quantities, doing the back order, and then reload the data back into this screen with a refresh, and everything else should then line up. So let's do that process quickly together. And the other thing I will do, now that I've actually demonstrated the first part of this, the other thing I will do at the same time is to correct the product code in Accrivia for that item. I'm going to take the X off here and save that data. That's the first action I was going to do, so that's going to fix my misalignment here going forwards. And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually address this purchase order and the incorrect received quantities. So if we right click, we go into purchase order view. That's put me on the right purchase order. I'm then going to undo the receive action on this particular line. I'm just going to slide that up so we've got some context on the line we're looking at on the screen at the top there. Purchase order receive reversal. That's been successfully reset, so we can see in here it's been reset. I'm then going to come back in this screen and do a bit of a refresh. You can see how our purchase order status now has returned to a waiting receive as per that second one. And you can also see the refresh has actually sorted out one of the two initial issues with this particular transaction, and that was that we didn't identify it because I had the X on the end. That's now been rectified, and so instantly the system's lined up the purchase order data with the invoice data, much happier. Back into our receive process. It's brought me in, it's defaulted the receival date to match the date of the invoice, which as a rule will be thereabouts. I can go through the receive process as I would, but hold on, we need to fix up the quantities received in to be correct. And yes, I do want to place that on back order. Now we come back in here, I do a refresh again. The status has now gone to received. My data alignment is now actually perfect, and my checked option has gone to green, meaning everything now is 100% in order to proceed forwards with that transaction. The next scenario I want to discuss is an imbalance that's the result of a freight charge. I want to draw some attention to two different ways suppliers might charge you for freight. One of the ways that they will present the freight charge might well be a line on the invoice that does not have a stock code. And sometimes that appears down here as a freight charge in the bottom part of the document. Sometimes it appears in the body. Same end result to some extent. We don't have a stock code that we've picked up. So while we're picking up a certain amount of information with regards to pricing and descriptions, we are lacking some information. And what the system's done then is it's brought it in as a line on the invoice, but you can see the stock code's not filled in, so I don't have the ability to automatically match that to my freight code. But when I click on this item, you'll see an icon here that's a little picture of a truck, meaning instead of manually inserting a line up here, so here's the manual approach. I could come in here, I could choose my freight and cartages type expense account that goes with that process. Often these ones are back in the cost of goods sold area. In my little chart here, it's not. I can save that line, and then I could move this item here up to the freight and cartage line by opening it up, choosing match line, assigning, not so much at a stock this time, but assigning it at the expense level. And you can see here the blue has come in with a certain colour representing an expense charge. It knows there's no stock technically associated with that. There's no purchase order information against that. And now things are actually in order. I've gone to 100% assignment and I've got a green tick box up here. And so that's been manually achieved by me inserting an expense line and manually moving the line item from what was loaded out to the second line. However, let's just reset things again. That same outcome can be achieved by using the little truck icon here. So that button does all the steps you saw me previously do in one clean action. It creates the expense line for the freight and cartage. It picks the item up off the invoice and it moves it to that freight and cartage line, and it classifies it correctly as an expense entry, as a non-stock charge, if you will, and therefore brings me to a point where, again, that invoice is fully balanced and everything's right to post. So that little button, it won't appear all the time. It'll only appear when you can actually use it, based on the logic of what we're determining from the information on the screen at the time. It's a lot faster, obviously, to use that. A reasonable question might be, well, how did you guys know the freight and cartage expense account was 368? That is one of the things that we do set up when we enable this PDF and invoice processing screen, to have that defined behind the scenes as a system setting, and that gives us the ability to do our bit to try to actually allocate to the freight and cartage expense when we pick up information off the supplier invoices that are applicable. You will actually find, if I go back through these invoices, you'll see here that this one has automatically done the freight and cartage assignment initially, and it doesn't have anything in the lower half of the screen in terms of an expense allocation. The reason for that is this particular supplier has got a freight entry over here, and it's just an amount. They've got no stock description, they've got no stock code. So sometimes you see that in the body, sometimes you see it in the footer. Accrivia will handle that differently. As soon as we are not able to determine all the other field values that go with a stock line, and we're just picking up an amount, we will then make the assumption that that will be a freight charge. And as such, we will draw it in, create that second line, assign it into that spot, and proceed forwards. So those are the two scenarios that we will pick up. And depending on the supplier and how they do their invoice formatting, you may have to do some of that action yourself, or you might find that the system does it automatically for you. That concludes the run through of looking at all the scenarios that might have resulted in an invoice not being valid to proceed versus being okay to proceed even if certain data was not exactly as we expected it to be. So now that I've gone and tidied up my data, if I was to press the select valid lines for post, you can see it's going to automatically tick all the ones that it's comfortable to post at this time. As previously stated, we will not achieve that with this one because it has to go through the warehouse receive process. Having ticked them all, I can press the post selected button at the bottom. It's given me a summary outcome of everything that was just achieved. And left on this screen, those transactions which we couldn't post at this point in time and we're still waiting to achieve in the future. And as soon as the warehouse guys receive this one in, this will become obviously able to be posted, and that can be done as part of our next process. If we now wanted to have a look at the outcome of what we just did, I can go in, I can bring up one of the suppliers that I just posted a transaction for, go to the posting page. There are the two invoices I just posted. The comment information has loaded through in a similar fashion to the creditor invoicing screen. I didn't key any additional comments, so I've just got what the system has generated there. The associated file that's been stored with that transaction has been brought across as per the PDF that we originally started with to do this transaction. Everything else about this is as per the normal invoice processing that you would be used to in the creditor invoicing screen. So there's no real ultimate difference in terms of the data transaction that's stored in the Accrivia system. The difference is the ease of which you can post it and the automatic saving of the PDF document against that transaction for any future lookups that need to occur. So that concludes our training video on the Creditor PDF invoice processing in Accrivia, which, as I said, also will incorporate other file types. It does already. And as we go forwards and various suppliers give us different file formats for electronic invoice loading, we will incorporate that into this screen. It can also, as I said earlier, be used essentially as a dashboard. So if you're posting all of your invoice processing through this approach, then even if a template's not defined, the ability to right-click and manually enter that as an invoice is still a bit quicker because Accrivia is going to have the additional information to work with when it launches into that screen. Everything else there after that point in time is as per what you're used to from that invoicing screen. And as mentioned also earlier, if there is job costing information that's relevant, then that will update the job costing system and the job in exactly the same way as the invoicing process does when you process manually at the moment.